myself do a lot of gluten-free cooking in my own home because unfortunately I have had to go gluten-free for 15, 20 years now because of health conditions. If I eat gluten, I really get horrible stomach aches and I feel pretty bad. But there's a lot of people that go gluten-free for a variety of reasons, but we'll get to that a little bit later. So a little bit of background knowledge to get started. So what is gluten? So gluten is a protein that is found naturally in wheat, rye, and barley. I know a lot of people just think of gluten as being a wheat product, but you do need to be aware that rye and barley have that as well. So when we're talking about labels and stuff later, that's really important, to have that in mind. So wheat gluten is composed of two proteins, gliadin and glutenin, and rye and barley have proteins with different names, but they behave very similarly. And then corn and rice actually have gluten as well, but they have different proteins, and those don't affect people with the gluten issues like the wheat, rye, and barley. So why do we need gluten? So gluten is very important, especially if we're using it in baked goods. So we need to have it if we are doing something that we want to raise. So if we're having a yeast, baking powder, one of those leavening agents, that gluten is essential to help produce the bubbles in the dough. So that air is trapped by that stretchy gluten network, and then our baked product rises and becomes light. So if you don't have gluten or a replacement that's going to work similarly, then your breads or cakes, they're either going to become puddles or they're going to be piles of crumbs, depending on your recipe. But we will talk a little bit about how you can try to avoid that later on. So there's a lot of reasons that people avoid gluten. Celiac disease is one of them. There's also gluten intolerances or sensitivities. That's what I have. And then there's also wheat allergies. So celiac disease is an autoimmune disorder, and about 1% of Americans have been diagnosed with this. But it is estimated that there are a lot of people in the United States that are undiagnosed. And exposure to just very small, minimal amounts of gluten are going to affect someone with celiac disease. So it can cause a lot of issues like intestinal damage, fatigue, anemia, bone disease, lots of other things. So celiac disease is when your immune system sees gluten as a toxin, and then the body attacks that gluten. And then sometimes the body is also attacking itself in response to that. So the symptoms of celiac disease and gluten sensitivity quite often can be the same. So unless you have gone to a doctor and been diagnosed, it might be difficult at first to know which one you have. So you do have to go to a doctor to get that actual diagnosis of celiac disease. Otherwise, if you're noticing all these things, you definitely might have a gluten sensitivity, but I do encourage you, if you think you have a sensitivity, still go get tested to see if you have celiac. So some of those symptoms include things like fatigue, migraine headaches, heartburn, constipation, abdominal pain, weight loss, weight gain, nausea, and many more. So quite often you're just going to feel pretty rotten if you have either of these conditions. And then a wheat allergy, it's different from a gluten intolerance, and quite often it's going to show up in many of the same ways as another food allergy. So someone with wheat allergies is going to be experiencing things like itchiness, shortness of breath, wheezing, hives, and potentially anaphylactic shock. So just like any other food allergies, wheat allergies need to be treated very seriously. So there's a lot of reasons that people choose to go gluten-free. So maybe you've been told by your doctor. So it's not necessarily just you have a gluten intolerance or you have celiac. There's some people with other medical conditions that by removing gluten from their diet, they feel a lot better. I've known of individuals with rheumatoid arthritis or other health issues that by going off of gluten, that's made a difference in their health. Some people just feel better when they stop eating gluten. Depending on the child and their diet, it has been shown that in certain children, it can improve their behavior if they have ADHD or autism, or some people just want to. They just want to make that personal choice to not eat gluten. So one thing I've really experienced in my life, at least at the beginning, is that eliminating gluten isn't easy. It's not simple. Once you've done it for several years, like I have, it's something that you just live with, and it becomes just part of your daily life. And most of the time you don't even really think about it. But if you are having issues with gluten, then it's not a short-term proposition. It's something you're going to have to just change your diet for long-term for good. There's not a pill, there's not a fix-it-all for gluten intolerance. You just have to remove that food product from your diet. But most people I've spoken to, if gluten is causing them health issues, once they have fully removed gluten from their diet, and it's going to take at least a few weeks, maybe even a few months to see all of those effects from removing gluten, you're going to feel a lot better. You're going to have improved health. So it's definitely something to be thinking about. While it does seem kind of daunting, to give up some of those things that we automatically think of when we think about those wheat or gluten products, we think pastas, breads, cakes, crackers, pretzels, pretzels, pizza, bagels, donuts. All of those are things that you can't just necessarily grab straight from the store, but you'll learn as we go along that there's really some options for you out there. You don't have to give up everything. You just have to do things a little bit different. So like I said, the good news is, while it feels like there's a lot of things you can't eat, the truth is there are many more foods on the gluten-free list than on that forbidden list. And especially these last 5-10 years, the amount of gluten-free products has really just blown up and expanded. I know when I first had to go off gluten, the options of ready-made stuff or mixes I could find at the store were pretty minimal. Some of the stuff wasn't so great. Honestly, some of the gluten-free bread I could find in the store, I'd rather eat a piece of cardboard. But that was, 10 plus years ago. A lot of the products now have really improved in quality. And you can find gluten-free products in a lot of different places. They're in health food stores. You can order them online. Most supermarkets, grocery stores have them. So there's a lot of different options out there. So what about oats? This is something we do hear about quite a bit. And oats have been on and off the gluten-free list for years. It's kind of one of those, I guess, controversial topics. And why this is it's not the oat itself. It's that most oats are processed in the same facilities as wheat. So when you are having that cross-contamination and using that same equipment for oats and wheat, then you could be getting some of that gluten and proteins from your wheat into your oats, thus making it not truly a gluten-free product. So if you are needing to go on a gluten-free diet, then make sure that you are getting certified gluten-free oats, or read the label, because it will tell you if it was manufactured in a facility that also does wheat or other allergen products. And there is a small subset of people with celiac disease that have a problem with the proteins in oats, and they are still researching that. But in most cases, if you can't have gluten, you can still have oats as long as they were not processed in that same facility as wheat products. So when you are at a restaurant, cooking at home, looking at the grocery store, these are a list of foods that contain gluten. So there are going to be some handouts that, like I said, Katie's going to stick them in the chat throughout the time, but also we will be sending links to a lot of different things. So these are just some different things to be aware of that have gluten. So beer is one thing a lot of people don't necessarily realize. Most beer is made with barley, or there's wheat beers. So unless it is a gluten-free beer, which there are some, that's going to contain gluten. A lot of your cereals are going to have gluten. Some of your different flours, so read those carefully. Gravies and sauces, unless you know what they were thickened with, you need to assume they were thickened with flour. Imitation seafood. They're primarily made with fish, but they throw a little bit of flour in there. Soy sauce has wheat. A lot of these are obvious bread products, but then there's some too. Malts. So anything that's malt typically has gluten in it. So these are a lot of different things just to be aware of. And then there's things that might contain gluten. So if it's a product that doesn't specifically say it's gluten-free, you want to be careful with these different ingredients. So some baking powders do have gluten, most don't, but there's a few out there, some different colors, some flavorings, marinades, and modified food starch. I encourage you to be careful with that because that could be cornstarch, it could be wheat starch. So I only purchase a product or use it if it says specifically modified cornstarch. If it says that modified food starch, it's questionable. Non-dairy creamers, oat products, like we mentioned, some salad dressings, some different sauces, some broths. So really just be cautious about some of these things if the product isn't labeled gluten-free. But there's a lot of non-gluten foods, and this is just a small sampling. And a lot of these are things that you would be substituting for gluten-containing ingredients. So there's a lot of flours out there, and we'll go more into that a little bit. So there's almond flour, there's nut flours, there's also flours out of potato, rice, tapioca. There's chickpea flour, lentil flour, there's lots of different things. And then like xanthan gum is something that they add to gluten-free flours. And I know when I'm mixing my own flour, xanthan gum is something that I add, and that is a substitute to kind of help do what gluten does. Corn is a great substitute in a lot of things if you are trying to steer clear of gluten. But there's some good news with reading labels. So in 2004, the FDA has required labeling of any product containing wheat. So if you are shopping, you'll notice when you look at that label that typically it says at the end of the ingredient label that it contains wheat, it contains milk, it contains tree nuts. So any of those top 8 allergens are going to be listed. However, because barley and rye are not considered common allergens, they don't have to be included on the label. So just because we know wheat is mentioned, you still need to read carefully and watch for that barley, rye, malt, any of those things. But also this only applies to foods processed in the United States and Canada. So if you are purchasing products from overseas or you're traveling, they might not have the labeling in the same way that we do here in the United States. So is gluten-free healthier? It can be. So just like any normal diet, any type of foods that we eat on a regular basis, we can make those choices to make whatever our food restrictions are to be healthier or not healthier. If going gluten-free is going to cause you to eat more fruits and vegetables, eat less processed foods, and eat more home-cooked meals, then definitely it can be a healthier choice. And it can overall lead to a healthier you. Quite often it is going to make you pay more attention to what you are eating, especially in the beginning. One thing I really encourage you to do is don't try to replicate your old diet. If you were eating a lot of carbs, then maybe instead of trying to find gluten-free substitutes for all of those, try to incorporate some other foods. So still have some carbs, but have more fruits and vegetables, have lean meats, have dairy, and think of your gluten-free lifestyle as an adventure. It's your ticket to try some new things, eat stuff you've never had before, make new recipes. So some tips that I encourage for this healthier gluten-free eating. Don't just go gorge on gluten-free brownies and cookies. Whether you make them yourself or purchase them at the store, there's tons of options, but just, because it says gluten-free, it doesn't mean it's healthy. A lot of gluten-free products are going to have just as much fat, just as much sugar as your regular flour products. So gluten-free, all it's really doing is telling you that there's no gluten in that product. It doesn't just make it healthy. Be careful not to overdo those starches like rice, potatoes, and corn. Try to focus on some of those whole grains. So that includes brown rice, whole grain cornmeal, quinoa. There's a lot of great options out there. And if you are purchasing some flour mixes, look for ones that have some more nutritious ingredients. So maybe they contain things like amaranth, millet, buckwheat, montina, sorghum, or teff flour. Make sure that you're getting enough fiber by eating lots of whole fruits, beans, lentils, and chickpeas. So speaking of beans, one of the recipes that you will be getting, it's not one I'm going to demo, but one that will be sent out is one of my favorites. It's black bean brownies. So instead of having a flour, black beans are what is helping replace that flour, and they're really delicious. So I encourage you to try that recipe once you get that from us. Going gluten-free is a great opportunity to go global. There are a lot of other countries that their cuisine do not have such a wheat-heavy atmosphere in their foods. So try Asian, South American, Mediterranean, Indian. They've got a lot of different ingredients and dishes that have never had gluten in them. So they're tried and true recipes. And it's great, to do something new. We get stuck in a rut. So I encourage you, go try some new recipes. Stock your kitchen and your pantry with quality ingredients and cooking equipment. As if you have a well-stocked kitchen, you're more likely to cook at home, and then you'll be less apt to go out and just fill your cart with every gluten-free item you can find in the grocery store. One thing that you might struggle with a little bit is B vitamins. A lot of our grain products that we typically eat are supplemented with B vitamins or have B vitamins in them. So depending on what you're having in your diet, you might not be getting enough. So you might need to talk to your doctor and see if you need to get a supplement. And then remember protein. It's an important part of your diet, and protein's naturally gluten-free. So just make sure that you are getting some great protein sources with your different meals. So if you are deciding to take a journey into gluten-free for whatever reason, maybe it's just something you want to try, or maybe you're not even completely going gluten-free, but you would like to do a little less wheat and look at some other avenues. It is going to be difficult somewhat. You might not be able to go get that last-minute pizza or that fried chicken for dinner. Although one thing I would have to say is that in the last couple of years, more and more restaurants are offering gluten-free pizza crusts. So that's something I really appreciated, because in the past, if I went to a pizza place, I would just have to pick the toppings off, and that was my dinner. So I'm excited that that is a change I see a lot. You might have to ask for baked chicken or do other types of chicken instead of fried chicken. Although these are also things you could make at home, just it's not as readily available from a lot of restaurants. Gluten-free cooking is not difficult. It's just different. So there is sometimes going to be a little bit of a learning curve if you are starting to do gluten-free cooking, but just look at it as an adventure and just have fun with it. Quite often, you might need to spend more time cooking than you did previously, especially if you're trying to be more economical and make more things instead of buying gluten-free options at the store. Because while there is an influx of gluten-free products, a lot of them are very spendy. It's easy to spend a lot of money on gluten-free products that you could make similar things at home for a fraction of the price. Make sure that if you are needing to go completely gluten-free, that you are setting up your kitchen so you can avoid cross-contamination. You want to get rid of all gluten-containing foods, or if you still have, like I do have some family members, my son and my children, my children and my husband, that do still eat some gluten products. So I just make sure that when I am preparing their dinner or their foods, it's in a different spot, and that I have a special counter in my kitchen where I prepared gluten-free products. So one of the biggest culprits of cross-contamination a lot of people don't think of is breadcrumbs. So if you are needing to be gluten-free and there's other people in your house that are not eating that diet, you might want to get 2 separate toasters, because that's one way to contaminate that gluten-free product. So some other ways to make sure that you're avoiding that cross-contamination is wash everything well in hot soapy water. So wash your hands, wash the counters, any utensils that you have been using, your spoon rests. So maybe you are making a dish, maybe you're making gravy with cornstarch, then you want to make sure that you aren't, using that spoon for something else. Or if you're making a pasta dish with regular pasta and you've set your spoon down, wash that spoon rest before you use a spoon for something else and set it down. Color coding. So if you're able to have separate cutting boards, one for gluten-free products and then one for other products. And that's great for any type of food allergy if you can have different cutting boards, or have separate utensils, some utensils that are only used for certain types of food. And another big one is if you are frying something, make sure you're not cross-contaminating that frying oil. So only use frying oil for gluten products or non-gluten products. You don't want to be using it for this across both realms. So as I mentioned a little bit, it's easy to go overboard at the supermarket. So just don't just rush out and buy a cupboard full of specialty gluten-free products as soon as you find out or make this decision that you need to go gluten-free. There are a lot of basic ingredients that you use in your everyday cooking and baking that are going to be a gluten-free product. And there's only a few things in the end that you really need to substitute. Avoid impulse shopping. And I encourage you, this is something to avoid regardless of what type of dietary needs you have. Make a list before you go to the store, stick to it. Don't be hungry if you can help it when you go to the grocery store. I know if I'm hungry at the store, it's really hard not to add extra things to my cart that are not on my list. Also be aware that supermarkets have a lot of displays of nicely packaged gluten-free items. However, a lot of these are highly processed and they quite often aren't going to be as nutritious as the gluten version of that. And just making sure that you have some of those gluten-free staples on hand is going to make your life a lot easier. So what are some things that I recommend that you have in your pantry? So definitely you want beans and lentils. And these are important things to have even if you aren't gluten-free. And I know that soon we have a topic coming up of cooking beans, so I'm excited to hear about that. Having some different flours like chickpea flour or gluten-free flour blends, rice flour, tapioca flour, having corn. So whether it's corn grits, I use corn tortillas in a lot of things, cornmeal or cornstarch, gluten-free cereals. So there's a lot of cereals that are already gluten-free. So the different Chex, Rice Krispies, corn flakes, so any of those corn or rice-based cereals, as long as they aren't processed in a facility with wheat cereals, then those are already going to be naturally gluten-free. There's lots of different gluten-free pastas out there, and I've tried several different kinds. I've had the most success with ones that have some quinoa or corn or some different things. If you're finding a pasta that's just rice, then it's going to fall apart a lot easier and be much more delicate. So while it still tastes good, I encourage you to find a gluten-free pasta that's got a couple different types of grains in it instead of just the rice. Making sure you've got gluten-free soy sauce, because as I mentioned earlier, most soy sauces do have some wheat in it. Polenta, quinoa, rice, so brown rice, white rice, rice flours, and rice flours come in both of those, white or brown. Tapioca flour is one I use. There's potato flour. There's lots of different options out there. And you might be thinking with all of this, well, if I have to go buy these different flours, some of these different things, what do I do about my cookbooks? Well, I really encourage you, don't go throw out your cookbooks. Keep them, because there are most recipes that can be converted into a gluten-free recipe. So for example, my favorite muffin recipe that I use all the time is from my Better Homes and Garden cookbook. That's just a traditional muffin recipe, and I just substitute their all-purpose flour with one of the many multi-purpose or all-purpose flours that I use. And just know that if you are needing only a small quantity of flour, maybe you're breading chicken, I'm doing something similar to that, then you can use just about any gluten-free flour. So if you have rice flour, if you have oat flour, or if you have an all-purpose mix, any of those are going to work really well if you're just using a small amount. However, if you are doing baked goods, then you are going to need to be using something, a flour that's designed better for that. And so most quick breads, it's going to be much more simple to be substituting those flours. It's yeast breads is when we really struggle to get some of those products the same. But I encourage you, if you are wanting to go gluten-free, then most of the time it's not only is it less expensive, but quite often I like the end result better by making my own baked goods instead of purchasing them from the store. So as much as I would love to say, just, substitute this one thing and it'll be great, that's not how it's going to work with gluten-free cooking. There is no single one-to-one substitute for wheat flour. So you don't have to stop baking. This doesn't mean you have to, stop some of the things you really enjoy doing. You just need to either create your own flour or buy some gluten-free flour blends. But homemade can be cheaper in most cases. And then depending on when the flour was mixed, it might be fresher. So there is a handout that we'll send out with the recording when sometime in the next few days or so after the class, that has a bunch of different flour blends. So if you want to purchase different flours and create your own blend, that's always an option. There are some all-purpose flour blends already made, and I will talk about a few of those when I do our demonstration. So just be aware that it's going to take some time. It's going to take some trial and error. So when you are storing your gluten-free blends, especially if there are some different things like some of the bean or chickpea flours or some nut flours, quite often those need to be stored in the refrigerator or freezer. Some flours can be stored just at room temperature in your pantry or your cupboard, but just make sure that you are aware of what type of flours are in your blend so you're storing it properly so it doesn't go bad or get rancid. As with any other flour, you want to store it in that airtight container. That way you don't get moisture or aromas or anything to get into your flour. And then if you are storing it in the refrigerator or freezer, pull that container out, measure out how much flour you need, let it come up to room temperature a little bit before using, and then you want to remix it. So whisk it, shake it up, because sometimes it can settle a little bit in storage. And then always measure your amounts accurately if you are creating your own gluten-free flour blends. If you're just kind of eyeballing it, you might not end up with a very good product, and some of your baked goods or other things you're making aren't necessarily going to be quite the quality that you're looking for. So with gluten-free baking, just don't be afraid to try new things. There are, everything isn't always going to turn out perfectly the first time. I definitely can't say that that's been my case. I've had some things that turned out great. I've had some things that were failures. So don't get discouraged if it doesn't work out the first time. Sometimes you do have to do some adaptations. You might need to add a little more flour. You might need to add more liquid or do less liquid depending on your product. So most batters and doughs are going to look different than when you are making a product with a wheat flour. Quite often it's going to be a little wetter and sometimes stickier. But as with any other baking, make sure that you are using the appropriate sized pans recommended for that recipe. And in some cases, and especially depending on that recipe, some people recommend that you get pans with a lighter, shinier surface, because dark ones can absorb the heat quicker and it might cause the edges of your product to get done much faster than the inside. One thing I have noticed with some of the baked goods that I do, it does take a little bit longer for that center to get cooked than when I'm using that same recipe if I'd have been using a flour containing wheat instead of a gluten-free one. So do know that sometimes you are going to have to adjust those cooking times. But as with any baking, we encourage you, so if it says 20 minutes, set your timer for 15, check it at that, and then adjust as necessary. And then also use a thermometer to check your oven temperature, because while we might set the thermostat on our oven and we think it's fine because it is an electrical appliance, it's not going to be perfect, especially as it gets older. Put in that thermometer before you're baking to make sure that your oven really is cooking at that temperature that you think it's at. And you might need to make some adjustments. So there are a lot of easy gluten-free substitutions out there. I'm only going to touch on a couple of them today, but breadcrumbs is one. You can go purchase gluten-free breadcrumbs, but they can be quite expensive. So one thing I do a lot at home is I just take plain Rice Krispies or Corn Flakes, and I either crush them with a rolling pin or I put them in a blender or a food processor to quickly kind of get it into those tiny pieces. Although if you have kids helping you in the kitchen, then definitely putting those Rice Krispies or Corn Flakes in a Ziploc bag, putting it on the counter and letting those kids just go to town with that rolling pin. It's a great way for them to help, and it uses up some of their energy, and it can take a while. So it's a great way to keep them busy while you're doing some other stuff, and then they're still helping you create that dish. If you have a recipe that calls for beer, then you can substitute that with other carbonated beverages such as seltzer water or other soda, but not diet sodas. That has a little bit of a different effect. Noodles, if you, instead of purchasing gluten-free noodles, you can use a spiralizer to make vegetable noodles. So zucchini is a great thing for this. There's sweet potatoes, there's lots of other things, or you can use spaghetti squash for your noodles. So you don't have to just be in that mindset, well, this one called for a regular pasta that had wheat in it, so I have to get a gluten-free pasta. There's other options out there. And even if you are still eating a full gluten diet, turning some of your vegetables into noodles is a way to get more vegetables, and it's a healthier way for any of us to eat. All right, so before we do our demonstration, I was going to talk quickly about adapting some recipes. So I know quite often when we talk about gluten-free, we really kind of focus on those baked goods. But there are a lot of things out there that we can make easy substitutions to turn them into a gluten-free item. So Idaho finger steaks is something I really enjoy making at home. And the recipe for this will also be sent out later. So what you do for this recipe is you mix up, there's milk, there's some spices, so like thyme, marjoram, salt, seasoned salt, Worcestershire sauce. You mix all that up along with your flour. So if you were making traditional Idaho finger steaks, you'd use that regular wheat flour. For me, when I am breading or doing things like this, I quite often use oat flour. And that works really well when I'm making finger steaks or other items. I also use oat flour sometimes in my gravies, if I'm doing a flour-based gravy instead of a cornstarch gravy. However, if you have a gluten-free all-purpose flour, that would work great as well. Using something like rice flour might not work quite as well. It's going to be a little too crumbly, and it might not stick and have that consistency that you're looking for. So once you mix that up, you take your beef that you have cut into small strips, dip it into your excuse me, get your hot oil going, dip it into your coating mixture, and then you fry it. So in most restaurants, if you go out and ordered something like this, yes, it is going to have gluten, but if you're making it at home, it's a really easy substitution to just swap out that wheat flour for a different gluten-free flour. So we are going to switch over. I'm going to move my camera so we can do a gluten-free donut demonstration. And while I'm doing that, Katie or Serene, are there any quick questions, or we can just save those till the end if we need to?
I mean, the question I have is the same one I had last week, and that's if we are going to have smell-o-vision today. I know Keyshawn did not work that in with her air-fried catfish, but maybe today you can make that happen for us, Amy.
I would if I could, Serene. And honestly, I've got to say my kitchen does smell pretty good because I did make some donuts earlier this morning so I could show them to you. If I had the capacity and the knowledge to do smell-o-vision, I definitely would.
Well, thank you. Well, with that, I know that you're about to demo, but I do want to transition very quickly to a question that came into the chat, and that's if you've ever tried this in an air fryer.
Have I ever what?
Tried this in an air fryer.
I've done the finger steaks. I have not tried that recipe. I have done other recipes, and I've had some success, but it's been ones that had less moisture in the coating. So that's something that I would need to that I would like to try, but it should work fairly well. Just make sure that once you've coated your finger steaks, I'd probably let them sit just for a minute and let any excess batter drip off, and then put it into your air fryer.
All right. Am I the only one here who doesn't know what a finger steak is?
Yes.
Is it a potato product?
No, it's little thin strips of steak that you bread and fry.
Okay.
Yes. They're really delicious. They're called different things in other places, but in Idaho, we call them finger steaks. But that recipe will be sent out later, Katie, if you want to give it a try. So moving on to our donuts. Today we are making gluten-free vanilla donuts, and this recipe, of course, will be included in the items you will get later. So today I've got 1 3/4 cups of gluten-free flour, and I have everything pre-measured for just to try to make things a little faster. But before I go on to my next ingredient, I do want to mention, so these are 2 flours that I use quite a bit. This cup for cup is one that I recently started using. I've had great results with that. I've got Bob's Red Mill gluten-free 1-to-1. That works as well. But there's a lot of different flours out there. Also, I make my own quite a bit. I don't have any of that here with me today. So if you are, wanting to do that gluten-free baking, go out and try some flours or try some of the different mixes I'll send out. A lot of it really just kind of depends on your personal preference, personal taste. I know some people really like the flours that have chickpea or other things. Some people prefer flours that have more of a rice or a potato base. So just like I said, go ahead and experiment. So we've got our flour, and then we're going to do 1 cup of sugar.
Amy, I know you're demonstrating, and I apologize for interrupting, but is there a way that we can highlight you? I know that Katie has spotlighted you, but what's another method?
If you...
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't stop sharing there. Is that better?
Yes, thank you.
I'm so sorry about that.
Okay, so now you can hopefully see me better. These are the flours that I was mentioning, Bob's Red Mill and the cup for cup. I've had great experiences with both. So we've got our flour and our sugar. Now we're going to add 1 teaspoon of baking powder. An eighth of a teaspoon of salt. So as you'll notice as we do this recipe, really the only adjustment from a normal donut recipe is that we're using a gluten-free flour. Everything else we're using is already gluten-free. The baking powder I'm using is gluten-free. So we're going to mix our dry ingredients. As with any baking, you want to make sure everything is mixed together really well. So you've got that nice consistency. So now that we've got our dry ingredients done, I'm going to do a little well in the center and then set that aside so I can move on to my wet ingredients. So I have 2 eggs that I've already beat. If you want, you could use egg replacer instead. But in this case, I just use some regular eggs. And then I've got 2 teaspoons of vanilla extract. If you really like the vanilla flavor, you could bump that up to 3 teaspoons. And then I have, today I'm using regular milk. However, this recipe does work really well if you have someone with a dairy allergy. You could use a dairy-free milk, such as rice milk, almond milk, but just beware if you are using almond milk, make sure that there's no one eating that who also has a nut allergy. I do a lot of dairy-free and gluten-free baking because I do have some family members that can't have one or both. So I have done a lot of that besides just the gluten-free, but the dairy-free as well. And then I have a 1/2 cup of butter. And it does need to be melted, so that's why I had a paper towel over the top. Make sure that you cover up your butter, that way you don't have it splattered all over your microwave. So that's a mess that I have not enjoyed cleaning up, and I don't think most of you enjoy that.
As you're mixing, we have a question
Yes.
about the dairy substitute. Can this person use lactate, like lactate milk? I'm assuming.
Yes. Yes, as long as because there's some individuals that are fine with that, some not. It just depends on what part of the milk bothers them. But definitely, if it's just the milk that's missing that that protein, then you could use that as well. So I've got my liquid ingredients all mixed together. So now I'm going to pour that into my well. And stir it up. If you haven't done a lot of baking, it really does make it much simpler to put all your dry ingredients in one bowl and your wet ingredients in another, instead of trying to mix them all at once. Because then your flour gets a little clumpier, it can get a lot harder to mix and have that nice consistency that you're looking for. So it's kind of hard for you to see. If you were here, you would be able to see that this dough does look a little bit wetter than some doughs you might make containing those flours with wheat or gluten, but it still is going to work really well. So now that my flour is all mixed, or sorry, now that my batter is all mixed, I have my donut pan that I sprayed with cooking oil. And I like to use donut pans and bake them rather than fry my donuts. It's a lot healthier option. So once I have my batter, I put it into a gallon bag. And I already have some I did, so you wouldn't have to watch me do that. And then once I put all my batter in here, I cut to the corner of the bag. And then that way I can easily fill the circle of the donut. You can do it with a spoon and just put it in there, but I have found this method to be faster and much less messy. And you're still sometimes going to get a few little, dabbles of dough here and there, but it does really help. I'm making more of a mess today than I usually do, but that's okay. It's be easy to clean up. So once you get all the dough squeezed out, as I'm getting near the end of the bag, it gets a little bit harder. Those first parts, it does make it quite a bit simpler to get that in there. So I'll probably do one more donut and then move on so you guys don't have to watch me sit here and struggle to get this in there. But yeah, once you have filled all of your donut parts in your pan, typically the recipe we're making today is going to make about 3 of these pans. So it's going to make about 18 donuts. So once you have all your donuts in here, I encourage you to take a paper towel or something and kind of wipe off any of those little spills you have. If you want to make sure you have that nice pretty circle in the middle, then you can kind of wipe off any of that excess. And then you can take your donuts and put them in your 350-degree preheated oven. And then when you're done, this is what they will look like. So these donuts cooked for about 18 minutes. The recipe says 20 to 30 minutes, but it's going to depend a lot on what type of flour you use. If you're using some milks, it might take a little longer. Sometimes the dairy-free milks seem like they take a little longer to bake than the regular milk. And then once you can poke them with a toothpick, make sure they're all the way baked. Then you can flip them out onto a cooling rack. So once you have flipped them out, this is what they're going to look like. So they're light on one side, a little dark on the other. So they aren't going to be that uniform color that you're used to when you fry your donuts. So you can eat them just like this. You can make a little glaze on top. I like to put just a little bit of powdered sugar. So to do that, I take a strainer like this, a small one, and put a little bit of powdered sugar in it. And then just to get a nice dusting, I kind of just gently tap it against my hand. That way you don't end up with big clumps of powdered sugar all over. I mean, if you really like that, great, but I try to make it somewhat uniform when I'm doing that. So then you can see we've got some beautiful powdered sugar donuts. And I wish you could smell the kitchen. It does smell very fantastic.
Amy, I had a question.
Yes.
What if I didn't have one of those donut pans? Do you think the donut batter I could pipe it onto like a cookie sheet and it would work and be more like a bar donut or a donut hole?
Yeah, I think you could definitely pipe it into more of that bar shape or kind of a hole. You wouldn't want to make it too big or too thick because then it might be hard for it to get all the way cooked in the middle without getting the outside too crispy. But yes, I definitely putting it on a cookie sheet and piping it out should work well. They might not be as pretty, but they should still be tasty.
Right. Thank you.
All right, we will end the poll. And are there any other questions?
So these are more of a cake donut than a yeast-based donut.
Yes, yeah, these are a cake donut instead of yeast-based. I very rarely do yeast-based products with gluten-free cooking because it is so hard to get it to rise like those rolls or breads or other things. I do a little bit, but in most cases, I stick to the quick breads. There are a lot of recipes. It's much more forgiving to do a quick bread than a yeast bread.
I see.
Plus, I like quick breads just because they're quick. I don't always have the time for the dough to rise and everything else that's involved with a yeast bread.
All right. I think that's all the questions. And if any of you who are still on with us have more gluten-free questions, you can contact Amy and we will get you recipes and more information to you through your registration.